Thank you, Ezra, and thank you, Hillary, for organizing and for the alums for joining us. It's my pleasure to kick off this event by speaking about my job market paper, Trials and Terminations, Learning from Competitors' Failures in Drug Development. The broad research question that I'm interested in is how do firms update their R&D portfolios in response to new external information in changing competitive landscapes? This particular paper's research question is how do firms learn from their competitors' failed R&D projects? And at the heart of this question is what you can think of as a strategic dilemma. And this dilemma was best described by one doctor at a pharmaceutical firm who said to me, when the other guy fails, we throw a party and pee ourselves at the same time. So that really describes this tension that I'm going to get into throughout the course of this presentation. So on one hand, you have a market opportunity. When a competitor drops out, you have one fewer competitors, and if you do succeed with your own project, you can get a bigger slice of the overall pie. On the other hand, when a competitor who maybe has similar technology as you, trying to solve the same problem in the same way, when they fail, you might have learned about potential roadblocks that could impede your success, and that might actually encourage you to stop. So this tension will sometimes be present. Sometimes you'll just have one side of it, not the other, and that's what I'm going to get into today. So my approach is going to be to evaluate how competitor news changes a firm's propensity to pull the plug on its own project. And to do this, I want to separate product market and technology competitors so I can figure out the different sides of those opposing forces. My setting is going to be pharmaceutical drug development. I'm going to focus on phase 2 clinical trials. This is a great setting for this kind of study because there's a ton of uncertainty when you're moving into phase 2 clinical trials, but you're also investing a lot of money, and investors and the FDA are definitely taking notice. I'm going to leverage the variation in the timing of news because firms are hit with competitor failure news in different parts of their own R&D life cycle. And that allows for a very nice a natural fit of an econometric framework of using survival models, in particular the Cox proportional hazard model. Finally, I'm going to grade decision quality using subsequent project outcomes. So which firms are performing well in the wake of competitor failures? Who's making good decisions? Who's making aggressive decisions? Could they do better? So in the interest of time, I'm not going to get into all the theory or go through the detailed model, but just briefly, why do firms invest in uncertain projects? And we know from the literature that there's a whole host of reasons, from market structure to CEO overconfidence, that firms jump in and want to invest in a project that could take a while and have a low probability of success. So the model that I offer in this paper is a little bit different. I use real options reasoning with the potential for competitor learning. So what this means is that the potential of learning from a technological competitor can increase the real option value of a project. So if you think of a project as rather than one giant investment that's going to take years to find out, instead it's a series of smaller experiments. The potential of learning from competitors can actually give you more decision points, more experiments to learn from and decide whether to pull the plug early or to double down. So in this model, I show that the impact of competitor news depends on the informativeness of the signal, the level of competition at baseline, and the future opportunities to learn. And I think this leads to two theoretical contributions of this paper. First is, unlike the prior frameworks, I'm going to move beyond the initial decisions, because firms are really continuing to make project decisions, investment decisions, throughout the course of the project as new types of information come in. So you can think of this as like absorptive capacity, but as we're going forward, it's dynamic. Second, the potential of learning from competitors actually can increase a project value. So sometimes more competitors are actually a good thing when you have new decision points that can be formed by those competitors' outcomes. Empirically, I'm really asking the question, does competitor news influence project life cycles? And another way you can ask this question sort of more specifically is, how does recently experiencing competitor failure news of different types influence the propensity to pull the plug on your own project when compared to untreated projects that haven't received competitor failure news but are of the same age, the same stage, and in the same therapeutic area of drug development? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to really lean on the variation in entry timing, because it's very rare that two projects enter clinical trials with the idea of running for the same length of time and then opening up their envelope at the end and finding out on the same day or the same week whether or not their drug worked. For many idiosyncratic reasons, they're going to enter at different times, and you're going to get firms hit with this news at different points in their own life cycle. So here you have the age of a project, the quarters into phase 2 clinical trials, and then on the y-axis, you have the cumulative hazard rate. So that's the probability of being dead at any given point into phase 2. What I'm really asking here is, if you recently experienced each type of competitor failure news, and I'll go into that more, does that knock you off of that line? Does that make you more or less likely to continue with the project if you're in the window of time, which I'll define as a couple quarters? If you're within that window of time after the news, does it change your likelihood of stopping? So to be more specific, when I said I want to separate market and technology, the market you can think of here as the therapeutic indication. That's the disease. So that's like Alzheimer's, small cell lung cancer, type 2 diabetes. This is what medical billers put in the back-end documents once you admit a patient or once you're treating a patient with a particular drug. Then the technology is the biological target action. So this is the way in which a particular drug affects the human body and treats the disease. So commonly, some of you might know about the statins, which is one particular way of treating high cholesterol. The BACE inhibitors have been in the news a lot recently because they were the next big hope for Alzheimer's disease treatment. Unfortunately, they've all failed spectacularly. And then the CETP inhibitors were another big heart disease drug. And this is actually the CETP protein, which is inhibited by those drugs. So it's a very specific type of technology that I'm talking about. And what this leads to is sort of a nice 2x2. You have the strategic dilemma when you're in the same market and same technology, but you can also have pure technological learning when you're not in the same market, or you can have pure product market effects when you're in the same market, but you don't share technology. You're working on different approaches. My data is at the drug market and quarter level. It's panel data. I have data on over 10,000 projects that are treated during their time in phase 2, and that's from 1997 through 2014, and over 2,400 treating projects. So these are projects on the frontier of their technology whose failure is then absorbed by those around them, and they have to decide what to do. You may be treated in the 3 different ways: same market, same tech, same market, different tech, different market, same tech. And in the paper, I look at multiple types of treatment definitions. But to simplify today, I'm going to talk about this short window, 0 to 2 quarters, following each type of competitor failure. That's going to be the window of treatment, and that can turn on and off. So before I split apart the different types of failure treatment, what about just after any type of competitor failure? So on the y-axis here, you have the change in the likelihood of project abandonment. So this is the hazard coefficient of this type of treatment. And I basically find 0, that if you look at all types of failure events, there isn't much of a reaction from any type of competitor. But when I start to split it into same market, different tech, and same technology, now I still find a 0 over here on the left, same market, different tech, but in the same technology competitors, I find that there's a strong, statistically significant increase in the likelihood of pulling the plug on your own project. But what I really promised you here is the 3 different types of treatment event. So same market, different technology, I still find basically a 0, which maybe is surprising. Maybe you thought it would actually go negative. You'd be less likely to stop. Same market, same tech, I find this large, significant increase. I still find a significant increase in pulling the plug after different market, same technology news. But it's also statistically significantly less than the middle column. I found this somewhat surprising at first, because this is the pure technological learning story you would have thought over here. There's many different explanations, and some of which I get into the paper, some of which I'm happy to discuss in questions, of why this one either is more salient, or there's overreaction, or there's something very specific about that technology and market combo that makes this type of news in the middle more powerful than the same market, different technology news. But both do take companies' projects and move them off of that hazard line I showed you before. Well, this one doesn't seem to have any effect. So technology effects overall seem to be trumping the market effects. In the interest of time, I think I'll move quickly through this, but in the paper I do a bunch of robustness checks to show that projects at different stages or with different information coming down their own pipeline actually seem to react quite similarly to the different types of news I just mentioned. And one of the important heterogeneous splits that I do want to take a moment to talk to you about is low versus high competition, because this is important in the theoretical model. So in blue here, you have projects that are hit with each type of news when they have low numbers of competitors on the market. So they're not going to face much competition if they were to succeed. And the most notable result here is I now do find this negative, statistically significant result for same market, different technology when you're close to being a monopolist. So it turns out that market competition effects are there. Our models of I/O and of differentiation, competition are important, but they really only bind when you're talking about very few competitors here. Most of the time, it's the technology story that dominates. In some of the brief time I have left, I'll tell you about how I evaluated decision making. This is grading decisions in the wake of failure news. So when a competitor fails, you have a decision to make. You can either leave or you can stay. If you stay, it's actually quite simple to grade the decisions, because if you went on to fail, give you an F or a minus. If you stay and you succeed, then congratulations, good decision. But it's harder when you leave, because what would have happened if you were to stay? So I use a very rough proxy here, which is I look at the remaining technological competitors, same technology competitors that were in your area. If they went on to stay and fail, then congratulations, you made a great decision. You got out because everyone else wasted a bunch of money going further into trials when you got out. But if they stayed and succeeded, then maybe you pulled the trigger too soon. Maybe this was a knee-jerk reaction to news from some similar project that you thought looked like you. So what I do is I grade over 34,000 decisions to stay and 1,000 decisions to leave after technology competitor signals. So those are failure signals from competitors. I calculate firm fixed effects using an ordered logit model. And then I apply Bayesian shrinkage estimators to control for signal to noise, because some firms are making more decisions after competitor failures than others. So what do I get from that? So I get scores for stayers and leavers. The stayers, most of them are sort of concentrated around this 0, but we see some are performing much worse in this long tail out to the left. More heterogeneity in terms of leaver scores. Some are performing very well, some are performing worse. And when I throw in firm characteristics and project qualities, I only seem to partially account for this variation in scores across firms. Furthermore, when I map the leave decisions on the x-axis versus the stay decisions on the y-axis, I actually find a statistically significant negative correlation between the two. So you could be performing very well on your leave decisions, but doing not so well on your stay decisions. And that might be because you're actually staying too often. You're only leaving when you absolutely know from your competitors' results that this was a bad area to stay in. And vice versa, maybe you're only staying on the very best projects and you're leaving on too many. So it seems like there is a spectrum of how aggressive firms are in these decisions. And my guess from talking to firms is that they don't actually know where they stand on this spectrum, because this is not a typical exercise that firms go through in terms of post-mortem of a project. So before I conclude, I'll throw up this quote from Coburn, Henderson, and Stern, which is, strategy is centrally concerned with the process of how firms and managers respond to and exploit environmental signals. And that's really what this project is all about, but trying to actually give you some detail of at the project level how firms might learn from these signals. I've presented a new framework for valuing uncertain project investments. I've shown you how in the pharmaceutical setting, technology seems to trump the market competition effects in most situations, and that you really need to separate market and technology to capture the strategic dilemma that I mentioned up front and find out what's actually going on. Otherwise, it would look like no one's responding. And finally, I've shown some suggestive evidence that firms can improve their stay versus leave decisions. In terms of implications for both firms and investors, I think there's a few important things we can learn here. One is that, as I've mentioned, you really need to parse the different types of R&D competitors. You can't just say that everyone in the same industry or in the same market is the same type of competitor. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand the landscape correctly. Second, there's really an opportunity here to strategically plan for the reaction to failure news. There are patterns here that are predictable. If you know that firms might be able to respond to one another, you can anticipate their moves and you can anticipate your own. Third, I think firms can do an even better job, much better job than I have here, to grade their own decisions and figure out where they fall on that spectrum, how aggressive they are in the wake of competitor news. And finally, more generally, opportunities to learn are really everywhere in these types of innovative or knowledge-based industries. And oftentimes, these opportunities are free. So if firms take advantage of that, hopefully they can be more efficient in their R&D production activities. Thank you very much.